Okay, this is important because it's not just about a timeline or planning a timeline. We're trying to connect the planning, execution, monitor, control, all of that into executing the schedule. So as we move through the presentation here, we'll look at how schedules support coordination, visibility, corrective action, and overall project performance. So, and again, the fact that you guys are online and especially here in the classroom today is awesome. It really shows me that you're, interested in improving yourselves and your education and all that. So it's awesome. This is the agenda. Essentially, there's 7 parts to the agenda, the presentation this morning. We'll begin by looking at schedule performance in the broader context of delivery performance and why schedule management becomes central once we start execution. And then we'll look at the structure behind a manageable schedule, including activities, sequencing, dependencies, milestones, baselines, and then baseline integrity. And then from there, we'll move into monitor control, into task or activity tracking, comparing actual versus planned progress, schedule variance, and control schedule as part of project execution. So we've already talked about earned value a little bit as far as it relates to cost. You can use those same analysis tools to look at schedule. And we've done a little bit of that when we talked about cost, but we'll focus more on the schedule part here today. The middle part of the presentation focuses on the response actions, including critical path awareness, crashing, fast tracking, resource leveling, resequencing, and then we'll connect all that to buffers and performance baselines, and then again, earned value. And then we'll extend this into look a little bit about how schedule differences between hybrid and adaptive models work, and then we'll do some key takeaways. And if we have some time, I've got a Kahoot that we can do at the end. And so why delivery performance matters during execution? Well, delivery performance shows whether execution is producing controlled progress, outcomes, and value. So it's all about value delivery. It helps to start here with a broader idea of delivery performance. In project management, delivery performance refers to how effectively the project is being executed and moved towards completion. And that includes time, cost, quality, scope, risk, resources, communication, stakeholder satisfaction. So the whole sort of ecosphere of our project. This matters because execution is where the plan is tested by reality, right? So in the schedule, we're actually implementing the plan. Essentially, we're testing our schedule, our planning. A project can look well structured on paper, but once the work begins, the team has to coordinate those activities, use resources effectively, respond to issues, maintain progress towards outcomes. And that's the reason that schedule management becomes important in this discussion that we're having in the presentation. Schedule performance is often one of the first visible signs of delivery health, right? So we're either progressing on time or we're not. And when the milestones start moving or progress begins to slip, that often points to deeper issues involving resources, risks, quality, or scope. So this schedule performance can be one of the first signals that the project's in trouble, if it is, or if it's doing well. So the key idea is that delivery performance is about more than just finishing the work. It's about turning that planned work into progress, useful outcomes, and stakeholder value. Project delivery performance reflects how key project constraints and stakeholder results perform together. So delivery performance shouldn't be viewed as a single result, such as being on schedule or under budget. In practice, this reflects how several project dimensions perform together. Schedule delay, for example, may be caused by resource shortages, unresolved risk, quality rework, or scope instability in the scope. In other words, lots of changes going on in the scope. A cost problem may reflect sequencing issues or low productivity. So if we're under budget or over budget, it can be an indicator there's a problem there. A stakeholder dissatisfaction may appear when internal metrics look acceptable, but the project's not producing outcomes that people expect. That's part of stakeholder engagement we need to think about. That's why project performance has to be interpreted holistically. The PMBOK 7 supports that holistic view by treating the performance domains as interactive and interdependent rather than isolated. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here is everything's connected. In other words, projects should be managed as connected systems, not just as scorecards to each other. Schedule management becomes central when execution must stay coordinated, timely, and controllable. As projects move from planning into execution, schedule management becomes one of the most central management activities. At this point, the schedule's no longer just a planning artifact. It becomes a coordination tool that helps organize work across tasks, dependencies, milestones, resources, and deadlines. We're talking about the schedule as a coordination tool. This is significant because execution puts the plan to test under real-world conditions. Work may take longer than expected, dependencies may slip, resources may become constrained, and risks may begin to affect progress. The project manager, as a result, needs a way to compare actual progress with planned progress, identify discrepancies, and decide whether corrective action is needed. And that's why schedule management becomes central during delivery. It supports coordination, visibility, communication, decision-making. In many projects, the first delivery problems first become visible through slipping milestones, delayed activities, or schedule variance. And schedule management becomes central during delivery because it keeps everything timely, that we have timely distribution, timely execution. It keeps everything coordinated, it keeps everything visible, and hopefully it keeps everything controllable. I think we did this one, didn't we? Yeah. So from planning, a schedule creates structure in planning, but becomes a control tool during execution, as we've been talking about. So it's helpful at this point to distinguish planning the schedule and managing the schedule. During planning, the team builds the schedule by defining activities, sequencing them, estimating durations, assigning resources, and establishing milestones and deadline. All that work creates a structure for how the project is expected to unfold over time. And once we begin execution, the schedule takes on a different role. It's not only a forecast, it's not a forecast for intended work, which is essentially what the plan is until we start doing it. It's a forecast into the future of what work we're going to do. It becomes a tool for tracking actual progress, comparing actual performance to the plan, identifying slippage, and deciding whether correction action is needed. The process groups, the practice guide book that we have, helps reinforce this by separating the planning processes, such as there's a plan, schedule development, define activities, sequence activities, estimate activity duration, and develop schedule. All of those are planning activities. From the monitor control part of it is the control schedule, which is really the execution part of the schedule. So most of the schedule management we've done up to now has been all planning, if we're getting ready to start implementing the schedule. A useful way to think about the schedule is that it has two lives. It first helps organize the work during planning, and during execution, it becomes one of the project manager's best tools for monitoring performance and guiding decisions. A manageable schedule must be realistic enough to support tracking, control, and decisions. So once the schedule becomes a control tool, the next question is whether it's actually manageable. A schedule is only useful if it's realistic enough to guide work and credible enough to support monitoring and decision-making. If activities are vague, if dependencies are incomplete, if durations are overly optimistic, or resources are not aligned with the work, the schedule may look complete on paper, but it still may be difficult to manage in practice. These things like overly optimistic estimates, these can be problems on schedule planning, especially for new project teams. Once you've been working together for a while, then you can figure out how your estimating is working. But this is why schedule development matters so much. During defining activities, sequencing them logically, estimating realistic durations, assigning resources, and creating a usable visual schedule all shape whether the schedule can later function as a reliable basis for tracking and control. So a weak schedule creates more than planning problems. It creates execution problems because actual progress cannot be compared meaningfully to an unrealistic plan. In other words, we can't compare actual progress to a weak plan because the plan is not realistic, right? The project is. So there's going to be a big variance there. A manageable schedule gives the project manager something better than a timeline. It's a credible execution framework for tracking work, identifying variance, making adjustments, and communicating progress with confidence. So it gives you the ability to report out with confidence that you're actually tracking against a good plan. Schedule logic begins by organizing the work into activities, relationship durations, and key checkpoints. A schedule doesn't begin as a finished timeline. It begins by organizing the work into a set of logical components that can later be scheduled and managed. So activities identify the work that needs to be performed. These are usually derived from the project scope and the work breakdown structure. So the schedule reflects that work rather than vague intentions. So in other words, we're going to take from our scope baseline, which has the work breakdown structure dictionary and the scope, project scope in it, scope statement, and we're going to take those and break those in, take that work breakdown structure from that baseline and identify activities that go with it. And then the next part of that is sequencing those activities. That's the order that we're going to do the work. Some activities can occur in parallel while others depend on earlier work being completed first. What that leads to dependencies which show how one activity is connected to another, hence the logic in the schedule logic. The team estimates durations, which indicate how long each activity is expected to take under realistic conditions. And finally, milestones mark key checkpoints, such as approvals, major completions, or important progress reports. So when we take all these things together, all these elements create the logic underneath the schedule, how everything's connected, what time durations things should take, and what kind of benchmarks or milestones we need to make. Before the team can monitor progress or control variance, it needs a schedule built on clear activities, realistic timing, and visible relationships. Schedule baseline provides the improved time framework used to monitor and control progress. So once the schedule's been developed, it needs to become more than just a draft timeline. It needs an approved reference point that the team can use during execution. And we call this the schedule baseline. Most of the tools, schedule tools that I've used, will allow you to save different revisions of the baseline. So you can initially, once you start execution, you want to save that baseline and you report out. Now, if you start having enough change that the baseline, the variance, you're implementing change control and the variance from the original baseline gets a little bit big, every so often you can save a new version of that baseline and keep it updated as you go. But in practical terms, the schedule baseline is essentially the agreed version of the schedule against which actual progress is completed, it was compared. Without that baseline, it becomes difficult to determine whether the project is truly on track or behind or ahead of schedule. All this matters because monitoring control depend on comparison. The project manager needs a stable framework that supports tracking, reporting, and decision-making. If the schedule keeps shifting informally, then variance becomes harder to interpret and control becomes less reliable. That's why we want to step through. If we have enough change going in that, we're not really confident in our baseline anymore, we may want to re-baseline. A useful way to think about the baseline is that it gives the project a disciplined time reference. It allows the team to compare actual results to planned and interpret schedule performance meaningfully and manage changes with more confidence. Schedule control only works when the baseline is stable and changes are managed deliberately. So by this point, we've seen that schedule management depends on comparing actual progress to an approved plan. So we're going to compare our progress to our baseline. We want to identify variance and tracking actions or activities when needed. And that only works if the baseline remains stable enough to serve as a real point of comparison. This is where baseline integrity becomes important. And it goes back to what I was saying about keeping the baseline, a good version of it, available. The baseline integrity means the approved schedule remains the official reference until a change is formally evaluated and approved. That doesn't mean that the schedule can never change. Projects often do need schedule updates because of scope changes, new risk, resource constraints, external dependencies, or management decisions. What matters is how those changes happen. They should not occur informally or invisibly. They should move through a deliberate change process. PMI literature reinforces this by placing a control schedule and perform integrated change control into the monitoring and controlling focus area. And this also helps us distinguish the baselines and the current working schedule. Forecast and status information may be updated regularly, but the baseline should not be replaced casually. It should be replaced intentionally. And that goes back to what I was saying about making sure we have a good version of that baseline, that we've intentionally thought through it. Otherwise, the project starts erasing evidence of its own performance problems instead of managing them. In other words, if we just do it informally, then we're going to lose the history of our planning. A well-managed schedule's not one that never changes. It's one that changes with visibility, justification, and control. Activity task tracking turns the schedule into a live view of actual progress during execution. Once execution begins, the schedule only remains useful if the team can see what's actually happening in the work. That's where activity tracking or task tracking becomes essential. Task tracking means regularly collecting information such as actual starts, actual finishes, percent complete, milestone status, and other visible indicators of progress. And without that information, the schedule remains a plan. It's not it's not a manageable tool. It's not a good management tool if we don't track things properly. In practice, tracking helps reveal stalled work, late starts, missed handoffs, delayed milestones, resource constraints before they all grow into a larger delivery problem. This gives the project manager current visibility into what's moving, what's slipping, and where attention may be needed next. This is what makes activity or task tracking important. It turns the schedule from a planned timeline into an operational view of project progress. In my experience, when I've done this, you can actually get a feel for how the project is moving just by seeing the changes that happen as people complete work or they show stuff in progress. And by tracking these activities, you can see that in the schedule. Schedule control begins by comparing actual progress to the plan in a disciplined way. And notice it talks about all this as disciplined or intentional. In other words, we're not just casually going about this stuff. It's something that we need to really intentionally do in a formal sort of way. Task tracking or activity tracking gives the project team current data, but monitoring goes a step further. It asks what the data means when compared to the original plan. That's like I was talking about. You can kind of get a feel for how this is working. In schedule management, monitoring actual versus planned progress is the process of reviewing how work is really advancing against the approved schedule, so the project manager can identify deviations and respond before they become larger problems. The class notes that we have emphasize comparing actual progress with planned schedule, identifying dependencies, and using performance metrics such as schedule variance and schedule performance index to evaluate schedule efficiency. So we've got some tools to help us with this as we go through. And again, one of the things it mentions here about identifying dependencies that I mentioned in the notes here, new dependencies can emerge as project work happens, especially if you have a change. So you need to really pay attention to that sort of thing, because what happens then is you'll get down to a point where an activity looks like it might be complete, but there's a dependency somewhere and it can't move forward till that dependency is delivered. Well, if you haven't thought about that dependency, well, then you got a problem. And it gets back into what we're talking here, is that this comparison is critical because projects rarely fail all at once. Right? Problems usually emerge through small differences between what should be happening and what's actually happening. A task may start late, milestones may slip, or progress may be slower than expected, even though the project still appears broadly active. Monitoring helps surface these differences early enough for the team to act while options still exist. You can kind of get caught in a false activity trap. Is what I kind of like to think of it as, is everybody's really busy and it looks like things are going like they planned, but without really good metrics and really good schedule analysis of the real tracking of the real work, you might not get a feel for if things are starting to lag. People are maybe they're completing stuff a day late, and then the next week it's a day and a half late. Next week, so you can start seeing that go through as you do that. So this is all consistent with what PMI has in their literature for monitoring controlling process group. It's a tracking and reviewing and regulating progress and performance and identifying where changes to the plan are required. In other words, comparison is what turns the schedule into that meaningful information that we're talking about. So it's like I said, you can get caught in this activity trap where everybody looks busy and it looks like we're doing work, but you can identify if you're tracking the schedule well, you can see when things are starting to vary a little bit. And schedule control begins with this discipline comparison. The project manager doesn't just collect progress data. The project manager interprets how actual work differs from the plan and uses that insight to guide action. So that's what I'm talking about, this insight that we have. A control schedule keeps delivery on track by monitoring performance and managing needed adjustments. So at this stage, we can connect the pieces that we've talked about into a formal idea of control schedule or schedule control. In the PMI literature, control schedule is a monitoring and controlling process. It falls under there, which is sort of separate and along with the project execution, but it's all part of project performance. Its purpose is not to build the original timeline, but oversee schedule performance during execution. Control schedule in the monitoring control process group, it reinforces that the schedule must be actively managed after planning is complete. So in practice, this means that the project manager reviews current status, compares progress to the approved schedule, interprets the variance, and decides whether action is needed to keep delivery aligned with expectations. And that action may involve updating the current schedule, reallocating resources, resequencing work, escalating issues, or pursuing other corrective responses. So controlling the schedule is a formal management process that ties the tracking, comparison, decision-making, and adjustment all together. And it's what keeps the schedule intact, keeps the schedule baseline integrity. The schedule variance signals whether the progress is moving faster or slower than planned. Once we're actually monitoring actual versus planned progress, the next question is, what is the schedule variance actually telling us? In earned value terms, schedule variance, or SV, is calculated as earned value minus planned value. A positive schedule variance means the project is ahead of schedule, while the negative schedule variance means that it's behind schedule. It's the same with as we talked about a couple of weeks ago with the budgeting, earned value budgeting. That sounds pretty straightforward, but the more important point is how we interpret it. Schedule variance it's a signal. It's not a diagnosis. It doesn't tell us what's going on. It just tells us there's something going on. A negative variance tells the project manager that progress is lagging behind plan, but it doesn't explain why. And the cause might be unrealistic durations, resource issues, rework, unresolved risk, procurement delays, and scope instability. And that's what makes schedule variance useful, because to the project manager, it's an early indication that delivery performance may need attention. But it also prompts a follow-up question: what's causing the gap and what response makes sense? One thing to think about, we talk about rework and how all these things can happen. I don't know if you're familiar with, like, you've all been somewhere like at a concert or in a place where they're using a microphone and you've heard that squelchy feedback sound, right? Well, what that is, that's the sound from the room going back through the microphone, back through the amplifier, and back out. And each time it goes, it gets louder and louder until in higher pitch, until eventually, it's painful to hear. Well, what that signal is doing, it's consuming resources from the amplification and the electronics that's going on in the circuitry. Rework and all these things we just talked about here, the resource shortages, all those problems work like that feedback. In other words, once they occur, that has to come back into the planning process somehow and back through our project management processes. And what that does along the way, it consumes resources. And eventually you get to a point where you're just stalled. The project can't move because we've got so much of this rework that's going through the system, this replanning, this recycling. And every time something like that recycles, it's going to steal resources. And what the implication here is, in my experience, it's usually really subtle at first. And it, just like in a squelching circuit, microphone, it gets more and more pronounced, more and more pronounced until you have to take some kind of action. And the best thing to do is to basically take care of it at the beginning so it doesn't consume up your resources. Now, in the microphone amplifier, it'll go to the point where it actually blows out the circuitry in the amplifier, and you just can't use it. It becomes a brick, basically. It's kind of like that in project management. So again, all these things feed back into the cycle. They consume resources and create more and more problems for us. If in that variance that we're talking about here can be just a real subtle indicator that something's going on. Critical path awareness is something we need to be conscious of. The critical path, delays on the critical path work directly to threaten the project's planned finish date. As schedule control becomes more active, we need to, as project managers, we need to know which work matters most to finish to the finish date. And that's where the critical path awareness becomes important. We talked about critical path in the planning 6151. It's the longest sequence of activities that must be completed on time for the project to finish as planned. In other words, it's that sequence of activities through the project schedule where there's no float or slack. In other words, when one of them finishes, the next one has to start. If it's delayed by a day, then the scheduled delivery date the end of the date gets pushed out. It's also the shortest time that we can complete the project. So if the critical path, if you add up all of those activities together, all the estimated durations of them, and so maybe that's 350 days, well, that's the shortest time that you'll be able to do it because you've got to complete all of those activities. So it's the longest path through the schedule, but it's also the shortest time that we can complete the work. So if a activity or a task on the critical path slips, the delay moves directly into the project's planned finish date. So it pushes up. It's like, having a bunch of ping pong balls in a tube and you push one ping pong ball at the end and the other one pops out. So you push the dates, it just keeps pushing the dates out. And the delay can move directly into the project's planned finish date unless we take some kind of action. By contrast, non-critical tasks may have enough float or slack that a small delay doesn't immediately affect project completion. So you'll see this a lot in schedules where you have an activity that finishes on a certain date, but it might be a week before the successor activity needs to start. So you've got a float in there of a week, 5 to 7 days. So you might be able to start that one a little later, might be able to finish it a little bit later. You've got some flexibility there. And that's a big part of critical path analysis when we get here. But all these things is why the critical path work deserves closer attention during execution. It helps us as project managers focus on the parts of the schedule that most affect delivery, timing, rather than reacting to every variance. So we're really, we may have some variance between some of these non-critical path activities, but it's the variance on the critical path activities that really should get our attention. And critical path awareness, in other words, when we're analyzing things, we need to be aware of how these changes affect the critical path. It helps the team distinguish between what's called general schedule activity and schedule driving activity, which is exactly what the project manager needs to know before deciding how to respond to a delay. Okay, so the critical path activities are driving the schedule, essentially. And it doesn't mean that a delay in a non-critical path item can be a problem. If it delays long enough, it can wind up on the critical path itself. In other words, if you eat up all the float in that and push into another, if that if the path that task is on or that activity is on, it can move into that. So you need to, the critical path is something that once we're in execution, in planning, it's kind of static. That's our baseline critical path. So once we start executing, we need to really analyze the impact of that on our schedule. And most of the tools that I've worked with allows you to do a critical path analysis, and it'll go through the schedule and it'll tell you if it's changed or not. And so it's important to, as a part of your job as a project manager, to be aware of that. Keep that a critical path awareness. There's some things we can do to influence the schedule. There's crashing, fast tracking, reallocating resources, and leveling, essentially. We're going to talk about crashing here. Crashing is it's trading some cost for less time, essentially. Crashing shortens the schedule by adding resources to critical work at a higher cost. So crashing is what we call a schedule compression technique that shortens duration by adding resource or increasing spending to selected activities so that we can complete them faster. In practice, though, that might mean assigning more staff, authorizing overtime, bringing in specialized expertise, or using additional equipment to accelerate the work. We have the PMI literature identifies this as one of the schedule compression techniques or scheduling techniques that go along with controlling the schedule. The one thing about crashing, though, is I had a professor one time or class, and it makes sense. He would tell the story, there's some story somewhere. But it's basically a farmer would spend all day out in the field. I think it was corn he was harvesting. And he could only do like 2 bushels a day by himself. So he hired a friend to come and help him. And now all of a sudden they're doing 5 bushels a day. So they're actually doing more per person than it was when he was by himself. So he was seeing some economies of scale, basically. Well, he thought this was a great idea. So he kept hiring people. And eventually he got to the point he was busy managing people and wasn't really out in the field too much. And he noticed that productivity started dropping. So he thought he would go out and check. Well, he had so many people out harvesting that they were all, stamping the crops down, right? So there's a risk in crashing it's not a simple formula, I should say, of just adding more resources is going to shorten the duration. Adding resources could actually extend the duration if you don't do it carefully. So that's the point. Crashing only helps when it's applied to work that actually affects the finish date. So we want to crash those items on the critical path. If the team crashes non-critical work, they may spend more money without improving the date. And what the advice here is that we really want to focus on those critical path activities. If we have a big enough problem in a non-critical path issue that it becomes a critical path issue because of the delay that's involved, then yeah, we want to pay attention to that. But crashing can be effective, but it's not free. It often rises cost. It can increase coordination complexity of the project, and it also can create risk. It can introduce additional risk as we get more people involved, as complexity increases. And it may not work well for tasks that don't parallelize easily. In other words, we can't split the work off. We can't say, okay, you take half of what Bob's doing and you and Bob work together on this. There are some activities that just don't do that. You can't do that. And so it may not work well that don't fit that. So crashing should be treated as a deliberate time for cost trade-off, not an automatic reaction to delay. So when we're considering doing crashing, we want to consider the implications in terms of complexity, risk, cost, all that stuff. And one of the nice things about some of the tools is that if during planning we set up the schedule logic right, in other words, we've got all the dependencies correct, you can go in and play with the resource numbers and have it recalculate the path, and you can see it'll say, okay, well, now we're going to finish, we were going to finish 5 days late, now we're going to finish on time, or we're going to finish early if we add these resources. So you can do some what-if analysis if you use the tools correctly to do this, to analyze those trade-offs. And you can also, with some of the tools, I know with Project, I think some of the rest of them, you can load in a cost per resource, cost per hour, leasing, you can put in the cost in the plan, in the schedule. And it'll even calculate expected cost changes and things like that. So it's pretty interesting that you can do that with the tools. Another technique is fast tracking. Fast tracking is trading risk for time, essentially. Fast tracking shortens the schedule by overlapping work that was originally sequential. It's a second schedule recovery option, they call it here, or technique. Like crashing, fast tracking is a schedule compression technique. It works differently than crashing. Instead of adding resources to shorten duration, fast tracking reduces the schedule or compresses the schedule time by overlapping. In other words, we're doing things in parallel. We're originally overlapping activities that were originally planned to occur one after another. And we include this as a technique in the literature. It's called a tool and technique, and I'll call them techniques. And the fast tracking is one of the most common examples. It's one of the things that we can do. It can be attractive because it may improve finish timing without immediately increasing costs in the way that crashing often does. So for example, a team might begin parts of its downstream work before the upstream work is fully complete. Or it may run review and preparation activities in parallel rather than strictly in sequence. But the trade-off that we're talking about here is different. When work overlaps, the project accepts more uncertainty. If the earlier activity changes, the overlapping downstream work may need revision or rework. So it depends on how tightly coupled the activities are. One of the issues we have, though, if you have a dependency, a predecessor-successor type dependency, that means that those two activities are coupled together. And what that means is if a change in the predecessor can result in a change in the successor. So if we're going to try to improve our scheduling by saying we're going to take the successor now and do it in parallel with the predecessor, in other words, we're going to do them side by side, something happens up here could mean a bunch of rework and stuff, and something happens in the predecessor may mean a negative impact to the successor. It might integrate rework. And that's that uncertainty that they're talking about. You don't really know. I mean, it takes some good analysis, can do that. And where I've seen this happen, where it's been helpful for me, is say, and it's kind of a combination of crashing and fast tracking. But if I've got activity that, say, the same person is going to be doing several activities in a row and they're dependent on each other, and we're starting to get behind schedule, if you could substitute another person for that successor activity and maybe pull it ahead a little bit, so in a way you're kind of crashing because you're bringing an additional resource, but you're also assigning that resource to a different activity and bringing it forward. And now you have two people that are working on that one stream of schedule logic. It's a little complicated, but those are the kind of things that you can do. And so the trade-off, as I said, the trade-off's different. The uncertainty is a problem with this. Both methods, all of these things we do bring in some risk. In the earlier, when we talked about crashing, the overlapping downstream work may need revision or rework. So I talked about that. This increases coordination though, because now we've got coordination that has to happen between these. Crashing also increases coordination. So fast tracking is best understood as a time for risk trade-off. So we can reduce the elapsed time, but it also increases the exposure to rework and coordination problems. So fast tracking is an important tool. Another tool here is resource leveling, which makes the schedule executable. We talked about resource leveling a little bit in planning, because one of the things you have to do in planning is make sure that resources aren't overburdened with work, especially human resources, but even physical resources. You know, you have a backhoe on site and it can only, it only has so much diesel in it, something like that. You can only run so many hours a day or something like that. So everything is constrained. And that's where resource leveling comes in, is that we want to level it out so that the is realistic to what people can do. So, you're somebody that works, say that you have 40 hours a week of somebody's time. It's really unrealistic to schedule that person for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, because they're not going to be able to work on the project that much. They may be able to get, in most cases, most environments where I've been, it's probably somewhere around 50%, right? So they're scheduled 40 hours that week, but 20 hours of their work is showing up, getting ready, all the social stuff that goes on at work, office places these days. And back when I first started work, we didn't have all this extra. It was like, so we got about 80% utility instead of 50% utility like we get today. It's all good. I'm not saying it's bad. It's all good. But you need to be realistic with that, because if you schedule somebody for 40 hours a week for weeks, and it's not sustainable. So you want to create a sustainable pace. That's one of the execution concepts that kind of came out of the Agile world. It's one of the principles of the Agile Manifesto, is that you want to create a sustainable pace so that the team can work indefinitely, right? So if you are realistic with your leveling, then the people should be able to work at that pace indefinitely. But what happens if you overschedule people, most of the time people want to try to meet that, and they'll work really hard to do it, but you can burn them out. And what I've seen, especially in software, we used to do these kind of big lead ups releasing the product, and where people were working these crazy hours, and then all of a sudden the team would just like disappear for a month. They'd been holding up all their paid time off, and all of a sudden now the release is done, and now you have nobody around to plan for the next release. You have nobody around to help for, any kind of rework or warranty issues. So you get these peaks and valleys, and what you want is a good, sustainable, common pace. And resource leveling helps you do that. So unlike crashing or fast tracking, resource leveling is not mainly about making the schedule shorter. We're not really making it shorter. Matter of fact, most of the time it makes it longer than what we really might have originally done, because now we're reducing the resources. And what this will help us in planning, it helps us decide, well, do we need more people to be able to complete at a certain time? I can tell you how many times that I've worked in the projects, and the project sponsor will say, we got to have this done by, August 1st. Well, okay, let's see. So go do your planning, and you sit down, you get all the logic in the schedule, and you say, okay, let's level this thing. You go through and level everybody's time. And a good realistic delivery date is going to be like December 1st. Well, now you have to go to the sponsor and say, well, based on current conditions, if we start today, we're going to be 3-4 months beyond your expectation date. So instead of August 1st, now we're December 1st. They don't like to hear that, but at least it's realistic. It's better than going and say, yeah, we can make that date, and then expecting the team to kill themselves to get the work done. So this resource leveling is an important thing. So this connects to planning, because we can resource level kind of in real time. Once the schedules, we have it in the baseline, we've done in planning. Now we can go in and look at what's really happening. So maybe that 50% utilization was optimistic. All of a sudden, especially if you're working in a matrixed environment where you don't have direct control over people's activity assignments, it might be that person's manager has assigned them to, and now all of a sudden they're working on 2 projects, right? And I'm going to tell you, 50% of somebody or 50% of 2 people never equals 100% of 1 person, right? You better have 1 person on it. So if you try to spread it out too much, then you got things going on. This all can get to be a problem during execution if you're not paying attention to it. So it becomes important, because the schedule may really look efficient on paper, but it assumes that we don't have practical resource allocation. And the same person may be assigned to several critical tasks at once, and may plan to ignore capacity limits for specialized resources. And so the situation may appear that another problem with this is, I've talked about this activity fallacy that we get ourselves into. We're busy, so we think we're really doing something. You get the same problem here. The team is just like really stressed, and they're really busy getting things done, but because of the resource leveling, every day they're getting just a little further behind. So they're just like standing in a hole and digging dirt and throwing it back on themselves, right? It's really can be a problem. And so we want to make sure that the schedule stays credible. And we can do that by applying resource leveling here, making sure it's done, and implementing changes that need to be made if they need to be made. Another one here is resequencing the work with leads and lags. So resequencing changes the task relationships to improve flow without necessarily adding resources. So it's another response called resequencing. While crashing adds resources and fast tracking overlaps work, resequencing changes the order or timing logic of activities to improve the flow of the work. So in practice, the project manager looks at the dependencies and asks whether the current sequence still makes sense under the actual project conditions. And this is where leads and lags come in. So a lead allows a successor activity to start earlier relative to its predecessor. And a lag introduces intentional waiting time between related activities. This really becomes a real good tool when you're looking at your overall project and you're looking at the resources on the project. And you might have, well, I've got this activity up here finished early, so I can move Jim down here to do this and change the dependency relationships. And you can do the same thing, or maybe the schedules, some of these activities are finishing late, so maybe I can make up some of that time by starting something ahead of it earlier. We can do that kind of thing with the lags. Or maybe there's some kind of resource that we need, like maybe we're doing a construction project and it rains and we've got some lag time in there. We can maybe move that to tomorrow when it's not raining and still make our completion dates. Do that. So resequencing can improve schedule performance when the original logic is too rigid. This is usually what happens. When coordination can be improved, or when downstream work can responsibly start sooner. We don't want to do it just because it can be done. We want to make sure it's something that we're deliberate about it. But these changes all also involve trade-offs. A lead may create efficiency while increasing coordination risk. A lag may reflect real conditions while extending the timeline if overused. So if we continuously kind of push things out, eventually we're going to bump up against our critical path, and then we're going to start to impact the critical path. Resequencing gives us as project managers another way to respond to schedule pressure. Instead of only asking how to do the work faster, another question might be whether the relationship between activities should change. Okay, so we're back. So welcome back. Hopefully everybody's online. I can't see the people online right now, but we're going to shift from the schedule response options to how we protect the schedule, how we performance insight and tailored control aspects. So now we're going to, pick back up where we were and see how we bring everything together. And then the bigger thing to keep in mind as we get back is that schedule management is not just about noticing that something's late. It's about interpreting what the schedule is telling us and how we can use that information to make better decisions. So let's get back at it here. So we've got all these schedule responses. I've kind of gone into a big speech about how they work, but schedule responses should match the cause of the problem, not just the visible delay. So in other words, we need to understand the root cause of what's going on. After looking at crashing, fast tracking, resource leveling, and resequencing, the next question is how a project manager decides which response makes sense. And the answer is that schedule control is not just about fixing delay, it's about choosing a response that matches the actual source of the problem. If the root cause of the issue is a true capacity shortage on a critical activity, crashing may help because it adds resources or spending to shorten the duration. If some of the work can safely overlap, fast tracking might be appropriate because it reduces the elapsed time by compressing the schedule sequence. And if the schedule is unrealistic because of people, equipment, or overcommitted, or resource leveling is often the better response because it improves executability, even if it lengthens the timeline. And in some situations, the better move may be to resequence the work, escalate a decision, or negotiate a formal scope or date change rather than pretend the original commitment is realistic. So if we've done all these things, if we've considered all these things, and we present to our stakeholders that these, we're getting behind schedule, and we've looked at crashing, we've looked at fast tracking, we've looked at this, and these are the results of all this, and now we need to make a decision, and we come to the conclusion that we can't all these decisions are not acceptable, then the only other option might be, well, let's negotiate on what we're going to actually do? Can we reduce the scope or negotiate another start date? Now, all these tools we talked about not only help us kind of respond, but also gives us information that we need if we're going to have a difficult conversation with our sponsors, right? We go to them and they want to know that you've considered all this information. And my experience has been is if they know that you're informed, in other words, you've gone through these and you're communicating to them what you found, that gives them information they need to help you with the decision. And so they'll be willing to find a solution for you if you do that. So these are not just tools just to fix the schedule. It can be a bigger emphasis. And we'll talk more about negotiation and all that kind of stuff probably, I think, next week. So this is why schedule response is a judgment activity. The project manager has to weigh the time, the cost, the risk, and resource limits and stakeholder expectations all together. And a response that improves one dimension may damage another. And so a practical lesson here is diagnose first, react second. The better question is not just ask, how do we go faster? It's what's causing the pressure and which response best fits the situation. It's the idea. Buffers in contingency time and schedule risk. Strong schedules account for uncertainty by including time protection or buffers where risk justifies it, or contingencies. One important schedule topic is the role of buffers and contingency time. So up to now, we focused mainly on defining activities, resequencing work, tracking progress, and responding to delay through actions like crashing, fast tracking, leveling, and resequencing. But a good, strong schedule management also depends on recognizing that projects operate under uncertainty. And I mentioned that a little bit. All these things have some uncertainty with them, but still, the schedule should not only represent the planned work, it should also reflect the fact that some variation, disruption, or delay is likely to occur. And your delivery performance, the notes that I have in the readings this week explicitly mention that contingency time for unseen events or delays and uncertainty emphasize the need to identify and respond to risk proactively. So we talked about risk response and all this and contingency management. This is where schedule buffers, people call them buffers. A buffer is a deliberate time allowance placed to protect a milestone, a sequence of work, or the overall project from foreseeable uncertainty. This doesn't mean adding arbitrary padding everywhere. It means making a risk-based judgment about where schedule exposure is highest and where the protection is justified. I worked in one environment where one of their slogans was to overpromise, underpromise and overdeliver, which kind of speaks to this. What they were trying to do is say, let's underpromise a little bit, but give ourselves some buffer to deliver more. As a project manager, I really wasn't comfortable with that because I'm like, we need to really promise what we're going to do. And then if we need to add in some time, we need to negotiate that too. There was a little bit of a moral issue of truthfulness to that kind of statement, but it worked for them. I just wasn't really uncomfortable with it because it seemed that you were kind of keeping your stakeholders in the dark as to what you were actually going to deliver, right? So you want to be, in my view, you want to be transparent to what you think you can actually do, but you also want to be transparent to say, well, I've never ever worked on a project that didn't have delays or issues. So I think, and a lot of times what you can do is you can go back and say, at this organization, we've worked on 10 projects since I've been here, and every one of these projects has been a month late. So let's add a month buffer into the schedule, just because that's how we operate around here. And there may not be any way to explain why everything's a month late. Sometimes it's just the way it works, right? And what I do think is a good activity, and this is one of the things that comes out of the agile adaptive world that we can apply into the traditional world, is they have this concept of looking at empirical data. So we go back and look at this past project and we say, okay, we were constantly a month late, then why are we a month late? And try to look at, well, what worked well, what didn't work, and how can we improve? And then the next project, estimate more realistically based on what you learned. And then when you do in every such project after that, continue to have that same sort of learning activity. And then you get to the point where your actual estimates and your estimates, your planned estimates and your actual delivery is less variance. So we shrink that variance from a month down to maybe a couple of days, that kind of thing. And you can only do that if you're transparent with everybody. So the schedule buffers are useful. It's a deliberate time allowance to protect the milestone or sequence of work. Buffers are really good for like really hard milestones. I've mentioned several times here in the calculator experience I had. And we had to have everything in the school, we had to have all the calculators in the stores, like at Office Depot and Target and all those places, by back to school, which in the US anyway is like August, 1st of August, mid-August. And so that means they have to be, if you back up from that, which is a useful way to schedule, by the way, is to just start with your milestone and then back up from it. And if you back up from that, it takes, back then anyway, it took roughly 35 days for a ship to leave China and make it across to Long Beach and get unloaded, basically. So you go back, okay, it's got to leave the port in, I think it was I can't remember exactly what port it was, but somewhere in China, because we were doing them, they were developing them in Shenzhen, where they were assembling the calculators. And so then you have to think, okay, well, we have to have all of them in the box, in the boxes, all of that has to be done. That takes 30 days. So you back up and you keep backing up. Well, the thing is, if we miss that back to school milestone, we miss the whole year of potential sales, essentially. And we also, not to mention the competition eroding our market share and all that kind of stuff. So we would put in about a 60-day buffer. So we would want to essentially have our goal was like May 30th or something like that, into the current school year, to have the calculators in the warehouses in the US by then, so they could be distributed out by the first of the year. So that's where buffering really helps with that kind of thing. But it was a deliberate decision that we made with the stakeholders, with the marketing people, with the people that, all the people that took care of the supply chain for all these retail places that we did. So it wasn't something that we kept to ourselves. It's kind of my point. So a good schedule is not simply optimistic, but it's realistic. Is kind of my point. Buffers and contingency time help foreseeable disruption. A contingency is something that we've thought about. It's essentially their risk events that we've identified, and we've anticipated their impact and influence on the project. So we have something that, say this is the backhoe example, and we're trying to lay the foundation, and we got to dig up and we have to have a backhoe there to do it. Well, we know that, we've dealt with this rental company, we're going to rent one, and we've dealt with them, and we never know when, whoever rented it before us is going to turn in late. They don't know either, but it happens. And so we want to put in a contingency for that. We want to say, well, if it happens, then maybe we'll go call we'll have vendor B on standby so that we can get that backhoe here once we identify that. So that's a contingency. What do we do if something happens? Now, with risk, we can also mitigate and try to reduce the impact of that. And we can continue. One of the things about risk management is something we want to continue to do all throughout the schedule management process. We want to look at the impact of potential risk. If something that we plan to happen, the time estimate for that has passed, then we probably don't want to keep a contingency for it. We want to reduce, take that contingency off the table, but maybe we reanalyze it and it's changed, but it's still a problem. We want to do that. The only thing we can't do really is something the tool we have for it's called a workaround. A workaround is essentially what we do if something that we haven't planned for happens, and it just happens, and we have to take some kind of immediate action. But a workaround is essentially a response to an issue. And I don't know if you remember, but the difference between a risk and an issue is a risk is something that has the potential to happen, and an issue is something that's happening. So that's the difference. So contingencies are for potential items. Workarounds are for issues, the things that are happening. And buffers are basically gives us some breathing room in the schedule to make decisions, right? It's kind of like given the project manager in the cost side, we talked about in the cost where sometimes the sponsors can say, hey, the project manager or the team can approve cost overruns up to a certain percentage. That's kind of a buffer in the cost management. You give them say you're on $1 million project and you say they can approve everything up to $10,000. Okay, so you're giving yourself a $10,000 buffer, decision buffer there. And it's the same thing in the scheduling. So performance measurement and baseline schedule performance here is what we're talking about. The schedule performance becomes more meaningful when progress is measured against our performance baseline. And so we've been, at this point, it helps to look at the broader concept that connects the schedule control to earned value. And that's what we call the performance measurement baseline. Make sure I'm at the right thing. Yeah. So performance measurement and baseline schedule performance. I mentioned this a little bit, I think, with the cost plan. There was a slide on it, on the performance measurement baseline. And we've seen this as a schedule baseline. The schedule baseline is the approved time reference used to compare progress with the plan. The performance measurement baseline is an extension of that idea. That's where we integrate the scope, schedule, and cost all into one time phase coordinated basis for performance measurement. So in other words, we take the schedule, we lay over that the sequencing of when we expect to spend money. We also layer over that the sequence on when we expect to complete deliverables. We can do all that once we have the schedule done, and that becomes our baseline for understanding earned value. So because earned value integrates those together. In most projects I've worked on, we just kind of call it the baseline. We don't differentiate between schedule or scope. It's just the baseline. And now we do when we're planning, but when we're doing the work, we just kind of we're concerned about what we're delivering, we're concerned about when it's delivered, and we're concerned about how much it costs to do that. But it takes all this and puts it into one coordinated basis for performance measurement. Earned value emphasizes that it depends on establishing a performance measurement baseline. So we have to have that baseline. It depends on decomposing the work, time, phase, budget, all the things we've been talking about represented in this performance measurement baseline. And this matters because earned value schedule analysis, now we're specifically talking about it, is not based on calendar dates. It's based on the relationship between the work that was planned to be accomplished by a certain point in time and the work that's actually been earned or completed. And that means planned value comes from the baseline that's both time phased and budgeted. So it's all the same concept as we had with the cost management. It's not just from a list of milestones. So this slide here expands this a little bit. Schedule baseline supports ordinary schedule control. And then we've got the performance measurement baseline supports the plan value. We measure, variance, interpret, and get insight from this. And so again, we can use the same tool and the same kind of things. We're negative variance, positive variance. We can use we talked about the cost performance index before as how we understand efficiency of our cost. We have the schedule performance index, is efficiency of how we're using our time and resources. So earned value strengthens schedule control by comparing planned progress to earned progress. Earned progress is essentially just completed progress, is one way to put it. Up to this point, but it also can include things that are in progress. It just depends on how you've decided. In your planning documents, there's that schedule management plan document that we talked about. Somewhere in there should be documented how you plan to accrue time. So we're going to accrue things by the day, by the hour, by the month, by the week, and everything gets kind of estimate on that. So that's where if we have something that's, say we decide that we're going to track progress based on hours, then somebody's been working on activity for, say, 100-hour activity. They've logged 25 hours on it. We might want to assume that they're 25% complete. They may or not really be, but that may be an assumption we've decided to live with in our planning. So all these things, as I mentioned, are connected. So for schedule purposes, let's see. Now, earned value strengthens schedule control by comparing plan to progress, back to where I was talking about. So we've discussed activity tracking. plan versus actual progress, critical path awareness, schedule responses such as crashing and fast tracking. And here we're looking at the earned value management. For schedule purposes, the key comparison that we're looking at is plan value and earned value. Plan value represent how much work should have been completed by a certain amount of time expressed in budgeted terms. So again, we're taking all these hours and things and converting them into dollars, into budgeted numbers. And earned value represents how much work is actually being accomplished and expressed in budgeted terms. When earned value is lower than planned value, the project is behind schedule. When earned value is higher than planned value, the project is ahead of schedule. And while it's common to think that ahead of schedule is good, it might not be good. We need to look underneath and see, well, maybe there was an activity that didn't get reported, or didn't get, hasn't been started. You need to look into that. So the two common schedule metrics that come from comparing earned value and planned value here is the schedule variance, which is the earned value of the completed work versus the planned work. Schedule performance index, that's calculated by dividing the two, earned value divided by planned value. And schedule variance shows whether the project is ahead or behind schedule. And schedule performance index shows how efficiently work is progressing relative to the schedule. And what makes all this useful is that earned value gives the project manager a more objective view of schedule performance. A project can look active and still be behind. Earned value helps us answer the question is how much planned progress has actually been earned. So this is one way of looking. You can also take the schedule performance index to forecast what your completion date might be. So if you're operating at, say, 90%, in other words, under budget, under schedule, then behind schedule, excuse me, you're operating at 90% efficiency, which would be essentially 10% behind schedule. You can say, well, okay, for all the work that's remaining, if we apply that 90%, what does that do to our end date? You can just calculate that forward and calculate a new end date. And that can give you some insight into what's going on. So you can assume that everything's normal. Now, what you can't do is well, what about an atypical event? Atypical means something that doesn't usually happen. It's hard to plan for those, but you could say, assuming no more atypical events, say you're just recovering from some big storm comes through and you miss 5 days of work or something like that. Assume the weather stays calm. This is what we think that impact to our schedule is going to be. You can do that kind of forecasting using earned value. So again, using earned value to forecast schedule performance. Earned value supports forecasting by projecting likely future performance from current trends. One of the biggest advantages of earned value is that it does more than just describe current performance. It helps us forecast where the project is likely headed if current trends continue, like as I was mentioning. For schedule management, the most powerful forecasting signal is often the schedule performance index. If SPI, schedule performance index, remains below 0.1 or 1.0 over time, the project is progressing more slowly than planned. That suggests future milestones or completion dates may be at risk unless something changes. If SPI improves, that may indicate recovery actions are working. So we have all these tools and techniques to recover. We can use schedule performance index to analyze whether we need to recover or not, and which one of those might be the most effective. What that means, that's why forecasting is important. It gives project managers more time to act. Instead of waiting until a deadline is missed, we can use current performance trends to anticipate likely outcomes and decide whether crashing, fast tracking, resource adjustments, resequencing, or stakeholder negotiation may be needed. Earned value strengthens schedule management because it helps the project manager move from status reporting to forward-looking judgment and improved decision-making. Adaptive schedule management. We're talking about adaptive schedule management controls time through short cycles, visible work, and rapid replanning. So now we're talking a little bit here about the adaptive project management model. They're showing a Scrum, or I'm showing, I did this. I don't know why I keep saying they, because I did this. But we have a backlog, which is essentially the scope of an adaptive project. The sprint is sort of the execution mechanism. It's an iteration. essentially. They just call it a sprint. And visible work, that's this little board here is called a Kanban board. That would be similar to our schedule. And they got a couple of, this would be similar to our visual representation of a Gantt chart type schedule. And then the burn down chart is telling them how much of this, the burn down here is telling them how much of this they've completed, right? So that's how the adaptive thing works. And then they've got a review. At the end, they have this inspect and feedback thing where they're learning. That's that empirical analysis that they do. Empirical means they're using with real data. They're not, it's not anecdotal data. They have measurements, objective measurements from past iterations that they're working on. And then they replan and readjust the backlog. And that requires some negotiation with the stakeholders. So that's essentially how the adaptive execution flow goes, the schedule goes. So we've pretty much been discussing mainly from a predictive perspective, where the project manager develops a baseline schedule and we track actual versus planned progress, analyze variance, and takes corrective action. All this logic that we talked about still matters, but it's not the only way that we manage time. So in adaptive environments, schedule control usually works differently. Instead of relying on detailed end-to-end schedule, adaptive projects manage time through short cycles, visible work, regular review, and rapid replanning. The lifecycle notes describe Agile as an iterative incremental approach that delivers smaller pieces of work in short time frames and emphasizes flexibility, collaboration, customer feedback, and continuous improvement. The continuous improvement part of this is the review, where in the review is, well, okay, Miss Stakeholder, this is what we delivered. What do you think? And they get feedback. And then the team has its own review that says, well, this worked, this didn't work. What can we do to change? And they adjust and reprioritize, and then they re-estimate for the next work. Now, what's not shown on here, what I didn't show, is this backlog here is usually part of a larger roadmap, which the roadmap looks more like the project the schedule you would use in a traditional project, where it shows milestones and things like that on what they call a roadmap. And the reason they call it a roadmap is because it's usually we're looking at anywhere from, maybe if I put it in months, assuming a 2-week sprint or iteration, they're usually looking out maybe 3 months ahead, and they keep rolling that roadmap out as they go. And that keeps everything, what that does is that keeps everything current. This is really effective on projects where we don't really know what the scope is, what the final scope is going to be. Okay. And so that's how we do that here. Hybrid schedule management is where we combine the two. But eventually, sometimes they need to come together. Hybrid schedule management combines predictive oversight with adaptive delivery, where each works best. So after, we discuss adaptive schedule management, now we can move into this hybrid thing. And many real projects don't operate as purely predictive or purely adaptive. Instead, they combine elements of both. I had a student in one of the other classes I have. She works in the healthcare business and works on projects for them. And I don't know how long she's been working, but she says she's never been on a project that was either predictive or adaptive. They've always been some combination of both. And I don't know, and it's been maybe several years since I've personally have been on one. I kind of got about 2010 or so, I got moved into the almost purely agile world. And so it's been a while since I've done, the most recent example would be the Texas Instruments thing where we had the hardware. But, well, no, Match.com, I did some stuff for Match.com, and we had some traditional stuff there as well. Match.com was fun. They have this big wall where people that get married and they actually have babies, they send in baby pictures and wedding pictures. And they have this big, huge wall in the building in there with all those pictures on it. And if you're working there, it's really inspiring, because one of the problems, I don't know if you guys work in software, but you work and you never see the results because they're always in the computer, or somebody somewhere on the planet using your thing. But to have those pictures come back and you say, well, those people actually getting some benefit from what we're doing was really something. So that was a fun project. One of the things that they did, going back to this adaptive stuff, is where they brought it all together is they would have a hackathon, they called it, where the teams could work on anything they wanted to work on, as long as it was within sort of the vision of what Match.com wanted. And so we had some really cool stuff that come out of it. One of my teams, and this has been, like I say, it's been a long time ago. It's really kind of common stuff now, but they came up with a way, it was basically applied early machine learning to analyze a image that your portrait. Now, I don't know if y'all have ever done a dating site. That's how my wife and I met. We met on Yahoo Personals back in 2005. But you have to send in a portrait. And what they would do before, it's because you wouldn't believe the crap that people send in. Some of it's just disgusting. They send in. And what they would do is they would have those things, they would send them off somewhere offshore. I think it was Thailand or Taiwan or someplace like that. And they had actual humans that would sit and look at this and say, okay, this is a portrait and this is not. Well, they developed a way to analyze this using machine learning to pixel by pixel to determine. But about the time, I'm kind of getting off topic here, but about the time that happened, machine learning they were able to look at, and you could take a picture of a cat and say it's a cat and a dog, but they really couldn't tell if it was a portrait, based on the skin tone and the way your bones are structured and all that. And they came up with a way to do that. It reduced that expense by about 90%. I think it was like 15% of the images that it couldn't get a determinate, so they still had to send those off. And then they were able to somehow license that, do that. But it was fun. So that's one of the things that's really nice about some of these projects, if you do that. But again, not all projects. It's been a long time since it's been purely either one. So this is important for schedule management because a hybrid project team may still maintain this predictive ability, predictive philosophy, I should say, with milestone commitments and checkpoints and governance and external reporting dates, which was when we were doing the calculators, all this sort of predictive stuff was all going on in China. But they had to test. There's all kinds of things they had to do. It's insane what they had to do, and they had to have really strict, because there had to be documentation. They had to go to the governments, and it's a lot of regulation and oversight. Where the software, we had a bunch of math PhD guys in math. If you think somebody like me is a little strange with a doctorate, these guys that major and get their PhDs in mathematics, they live on a different plane than the rest of us do. They put it that way. If you've ever been around really brilliant people, they're just different. But anyway, they would come up with all kinds of things they wanted to do and put into the calculator. So the adaptive method worked really well for that. So anyway, but it gives you some flexibility. It gives you some options on how to do that. So as a project manager, though, you may be working on both of those at the same time, and you need to be able to deal with that. And you might be the scrum master for the adaptive team and the project manager for the predictive part of it, right? So you need to know both. And that gets back to my original proposition to all you guys, that in order to be effective project managers in today's world, you need to understand all of the domain, not just, if you want to specialize in an area, that's fine. Like if you go to the doctor, you want a doctor that's, an MD that's got really good, broad, but maybe you're going in for some, like I just went in this week for a dermatology thing. So the dermatologist really knows your skin really well. Okay, that's great. But they also have all this bigger, broader thing, right? So we need to be able to do that as project managers. And up there where I live, there's a lot of country doctors. They have to know a lot about it, a lot of things. So that's where we're going with this. And that's one of the reasons, if you're going to take the PMP exam, starting in June, they're going to change it to PMBOK 8. PMBOK 8 is much more integrated with the adaptive stuff than PMBOK 7. And here at Amerton, we're going to be, starting in the fall, we're going to be updating all the courses to reflect that. So you're covered if you're still here. But integrated delivery performance improves when scheduled data is used to guide timely project decisions. So this brings everything together. We've been looking at delivery performance, schedule baselines, fast tracking, monitoring actual versus planned progress, controlling the schedule, critical path, schedule responses, earned value. The broader lesson is that schedule management is not just a technical timeline activity. It's one of the main ways that project managers understand and influence delivery performance. When schedule information is interpreted well and supports better decisions about resources, risk, communication, scope, stakeholder expectations, and corrective action, in that sense, schedule management connects execution data to the broader objective of delivering results, right? So this is an integration point where we don't track schedules simply to know whether something's late or on schedule. We use this information to guide decisions that shape overall project performance. So it goes back to what I was saying about all these tools we have to figure out where the schedule is, where we are in time. Then we bring our own intuition into this to help our team, which is part of our stakeholder group, and our sponsors, the organizations that's most usually funding this, your projects, to explain what, help you make good decisions. So key takeaways: the strong schedule management turns execution data into better decision-making and delivery results. So again, throughout the presentation, we've looked at performance as a narrow issue, but it's a major part of delivery performance. It can begin with the idea that the delivery performance reflects execution, whether execution is producing control project progress or outcomes. Again, the idea is, are we producing results, and those are we doing it in an intentional, controlled way? And so from there, we narrowed down to schedule management as the clearest ways to see whether the project delivery is actually under control. Then we move through the building blocks of schedule performance and a manageable schedule, activities, dependencies, the baseline, the monitoring actual values versus planned value, and controlling the schedule. We also looked at several response options, including critical path awareness, crashing, fast tracking, resource leveling, resequencing, and buffers. The larger lesson here is that not every schedule problem should be handled the same way. A good project managers diagnose the source of the pressure and choose the response that fits the actual situation. And finally, we connected schedule performance with the baselines, earned value, forecasting, and different delivery approaches. And whether the project is predictive, adaptive, or hybrid, schedule management remains one of the clearest ways to turn execution activity into informed decisions and more reliable delivery performance. So that is the end of this. I've got a Kahoot here. Let me get it started. Everybody signed up that wants to sign up? Okay. What does delivery performance show during execution? All right, we got 7. Yeah, it shows whether execution is producing control, progress, outcomes, and value. All right, Summit. Cool. Here we go. Next one. Why is schedule management central to during delivery?
Not the one on the one. 6.
You may need to move up. All right, we got all of them. Everybody got that one. Cool. I'll give you a hint to some of these, the answers on the image. All right, we got more going. Oh, you were looking for the number. It's 6659889. All right. Next question. What is the main purpose of schedule baseline? All right, we got 12 out of 12. Well, no, we got one incorrectness. To provide the approved time framework used to monitor and control progress. All right, Summit's on fire there. Look at there. All right. What does baseline integrity mean? All right, so the baseline remains the official reference until changes are approved. So we want the integrity until we have approved changes. And the idea is if we're implementing unapproved changes, then it loses integrity. Oh, change in leadership here. Jordan's taken off. During execution, the schedule primarily becomes what? Okay, it's a control tool. We're going to control the work pace and the delivery of the project. Okay, Jordan's still there. What kind of information does task tracking collect during execution? Everybody got that one. Awesome. Yeah, actual start, actual finishes, percent complete, and milestone status. Good. Jordan's still ahead. All right. What is the primary purpose of monitoring actual versus planned progress? That's great. We got that one. All of us got that one. To compare progress to the approved plan and identify deviations early. Awesome. Leaderboards still hasn't changed. Next question. In PMI's process view, control schedule is best described as, yeah, we got 15 out of 15 on that one. Yeah, as a monitoring and controlling process. Still leading there, Jordan. This reminds me of Domino's Pizza. Schedule variance is best understood as it's a signal showing whether the progress is ahead or behind schedule, behind plan. Okay. Shaniqua moves up there, 7386. Awesome. All right. Why is critical path awareness important? Okay. We've got, yeah, delays on critical path work directly threaten the planned finish date. So critical path awareness is so we know whether things are being delivered late or early and things like that. So we're aware of what's going on. Okay, we still have that. Shaniqua's on fire there. Cool. All right, next question. Crashing is best defined as, yeah, adding resources to critical work to shorten the schedule. It's a trade-off, right? And by adding, we're going to be increasing costs a little bit. Okay, look at there. Nicole's on fire now. Has a streak of 11. How about that? Fast tracking is best defined as, yeah, fast tracking is shortening the schedule by overlapping work that was originally sequential. So basically parallel work. All right. Nicole still has a streak. We got it getting close here at the leaderboard. All right. Resource leveling is used mainly to, yeah, improve schedule realism by aligning work with actual resource limits. Yep, leaderboard's still going. All right. Looks like Nicole's streak is over. Erica is back. The answer streak of 3. All right. In schedule control, buffers and contingency time should be used as deliberate time protection where risk justifies it. Right. So again, I was talking about using those buffers and being transparent about it. Let's see what happens to our scoreboard here. Ooh, got a tight one there. All right, number 15. In earned value schedule analysis, which statement is correct? Yeah, earned value lower than planned value means the project is behind schedule. Okay, Shaniqua's still going. Look at there. Next, how do adaptive projects typically manage schedule performance? Through short cycles, visible work, and rapid replanning. Right? The little thing that comes up, I think I mentioned this, it reminds me of Domino's Pizza. This little question thing. All right, Nicole on the podium there. Jordan's on the podium. There we go. Shaniqua. All right. Was that fun or was that fun? Huh? Okay, I'm going to stop the share here.